Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Norni Lijon, and I am Director of the Information Law and Policy Centre, one of the academic centres based at the University of London's Institute of Advanced Legal Studies. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, wherever we find you in the world. If you would like to find out more about the Centre's events and projects, please sign up to our mailing list and follow the Centre on social media, which now includes Blue Sky. Now, it is my very great pleasure to moderate and introduce our event this evening, the book launch of Anton Moiseienko's monograph, Doing Business with Criminals Between Exclusion and Surveillance. Recently published by Cambridge University Press, the book provides a comprehensive and wide-ranging account of the objectives and history of financial crime rules. Across 5 very detailed chapters, the book identifies 2 key objectives that underpin the current financial crime regime. One is the exclusion of criminal actors from the legitimate economy, and the second, is their surveillance. An important difference between these aims, Anton stresses in the book, is that the surveillance objective is instrumental, but not an end in of itself, but a means of achieving law enforcement outcomes such as criminal convictions or confiscation of criminal proceeds. In contrast, exclusion can either be instrumental, if aimed at the disruption of criminal operations by denying criminals access to the services they need, or it could be an end in itself, if conceived of as a means of precluding regulated businesses' complicity in crime. Anton also explores the thorny question, among a lot of other very important topics and themes in the book, and the related scholarship by leading commentators in the field, including Michael Levi and Peter Voiter, on how best to assess the effectiveness of the current regulatory regime, highlighting that collecting more data and better evaluation methods may shed light on how the current system is falling short, but it may not necessarily prove that the current legal regime works or is good value for money. But Anton makes clear that this finding does not mean that no evaluation of effectiveness should ever be attempted, but simply that any truly rigorous scientific assessment will remain elusive, a provocation that I find very interesting and I hope we're going to delve into more later. Instead, Anton argues in his book that some version of the current methodology used by the Financial Action Task Force, the global anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing watchdog, established in the 1980s, which relies as much on gathering qualitative data, the views of governmental and law enforcement stakeholders, as it does as much on quantitative data, is in fact a necessary evil in terms of having this combination. The real issue, he argues, is not whether we should continue to develop our financial crime regime and invest into it, but rather how existing rules and practices can be recalibrated to better support those objectives with fewer unintended consequences. The book outlines that there are a few options in which to do this, but they all involve trade-offs. So while there is no silver bullet to the problems that Anton highlights, there is a framework for thinking about the choices that policymakers need to make, working in this crucial area of law policy and practice. So that is just a taster for those of you who have yet had the opportunity to read this really excellent book. And on that note, I am delighted to introduce our lead speaker this evening and our 3 expert commentators who will discuss the book's key findings and themes. Dr. Anton Moiseienko is a senior lecturer and research director at the Australian National University Law School, who's joining us today from Canberra. His work focuses on financial crime, including money laundering, terrorist financing, the legal and policy aspects of economic sanctions and cybercrime. His related publications have featured in leading law journals, including the American Journal of International Law, the German Law Review, and the Criminal Law Review. In addition to his recent book, he is the author of another monograph published in 2019 and has co-edited 4 books on transnational crime. In addition to his leading scholarship in the field of financial crime, Anton has also been an influential voice in policy debates over the regulation and enforcement of anti-money laundering measures. This has included giving testimony and advising various governments and leading institutions, including the Australian Senate, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, and the EU's Freeze and Seize Task Force. To Anton as our key speaker and the man that made today and the seminar possible, you are very welcome. I'll also take this opportunity to welcome our other panelists and introduce them. Our first discussant this evening will be Professor Valsimis Miselegas. He is Dean of the School of Law and Social Justice at the University of Liverpool. Previously, he was Professor of European Criminal Law at Queen Mary University of London. He is a highly regarded leading expert and prolific scholar with many books and articles published on the topics of anti-money laundering and EU criminal law, including his book on EU criminal law after the Lisbon Treaty, published by Hart in 2016. Valsimis is a regular advisor to think tanks, parliaments, governments, and leading legal institutions, including the UK House of Lords, the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. Our second discussant this evening will be Professor Peter Aldridge. Peter has been the Draper's Professor of Law since 2003 at Queen Mary University of London. He is a leading international expert and has published widely in the areas of criminal law, evidence, legal education law, and IT law. He is the author of several leading books in the areas of criminal law and anti-money laundering, including What Went Wrong with Money Laundering Law, published by Palgrave in 2016, and Taxation and Criminal Justice, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. And last but not at all least, our third discussant will be Marine Corhay. Marine is a PhD candidate at the University of Liège in Belgium. She holds a master's degree in Belgium and EU criminal law from the University of Liège and an LLM in public international law from the University of Nottingham. Her doctoral research explores the EU legal framework governing the role of online service providers in cross-border cooperation with law enforcement authorities for access to electronic communications data. Her academic background and professional experience span Belgium and European criminal law, human rights law, and cybercrime. She has undertaken research stays at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies here at the University of London and at the Georgia Institute of Technology in the US, where her work focused respectively on the US approach to direct cooperation with online service providers and the role of service providers in the EU Digital Services Act and the EU e-evidence regulation. In terms of the format, when our speakers have all presented, we'll open up the discussion to the floor for a Q&A with any remaining time. So now I would like to thank our speakers and you again for joining us. And I'll invite Dr. Anton Moiseienko to begin our seminar this evening with a brief introduction and overview to his book, Doing Business with Criminals. Anton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nora, for organizing this excellent event. And a huge thank you to Valsimis, Peter, and Marine for taking the time to read the book and also share their reflections, which I very much look forward to. And I suspect we might disagree on some of the claims that I made in the book. So it's promising to be a spirited, but I hope enlightening discussion. So thank you very much again. I will provide very brief context for the book, and thank you, Nora, for encapsulating some of the main messages so pithily. I feel that there's actually not that much that I need to do by way of telling the audience about the main message of the book and the duality of objectives in anti-money laundering regulation, but I will start with a couple of brief contextual observations. Whenever one goes to a financial crime conference, I can't help but being struck by the similarity of some of the key critiques that people make of the existing regime. And those are critiques that are made not only by academics, and people like Peter and Valsimis have been particularly influential in the academic debate on those matters, but there are also critiques raised by law enforcement officers, policymakers, banking compliance experts, and anyone who's at all adjacent to this area of law and policy. So what are some of those critiques? Well, anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regulation is one of the most intrusive but also misunderstood regulatory domains. It is intrusive because whatever we do in our daily financial lives, taking out a mortgage, using a bank card to pay for a cup of coffee in the morning, anything at all, there is this machinery humming in the background of banks trying to identify whether our activities are suspicious. And they do so through a mixture of automated processes and human review. And if a certain activity is in fact deemed to rise to that level of suspicion, an obligation exists to report it to governments. So what we're seeing in developed financial centers is in effect a wholesale transfer of sensitive financial information to governments. For example, in the UK, every year, hundreds of thousands of suspicious activity reports are filed, not only by banks, but by other regulated businesses as well, primarily, though, by banks. What about the law enforcement value of those reports? This is an area of perennial contestation. We know that very, very few of them, a couple percent, not more, generate investigations. Only a small proportion lead to actual law enforcement action. On the other hand, you might hear governments say that having that database of suspicious activity reports is useful should they wish to draw on it in the future. In any event, whichever way you slice and dice it, questions around the effectiveness, efficiency, and value for money of this financial surveillance regime abound. And of course, if you are a higher risk customer, then the entire area of anti-money laundering regulation creates incentives for banks to drop you as a customer, or in the lingo of this area, to de-risk you. And that is because if you keep triggering alerts in your bank and the bank needs to report you, that costs money. If you are adjudged to be a high-risk customer and enhanced due diligence needs to be applied, then again, that costs money. And so the natural incentives are to over-report, so you're not punished by your regulators, but also to de-risk. And this is the context for the book. How did we end up with the regime that so many people involved in it say does not provide good law enforcement outcomes and falls short of value for money? How did we end up here? What are the elements of the current regime that are worthwhile? What are the elements, if any, that could be jettisoned? And what does the way forward look like? In undertaking an examination of this, I drew on the experience that I've collected over the past 10 years studying AML CTF regulation, both academically and in a policy research role. And I've also carried out a number of interviews with a select group of people who were there as the regime was being set up in the late 80s and 90s. And there are three main points that I wanted to make in the book. First of all, the history of anti-money laundering regulation is not quite forgotten, but perhaps not as well studied as it deserves to be. And one of the things that struck me in this history is just how much it spans jurisdictions, geographies, and decades. So what we're talking about is not just something that the Financial Action Task Force pieced together in its first meeting in Paris in 1989, but rather something that has accreted over time, with various ideas being tried and tested in the United States, Switzerland, the UK, and other places, and emerging over decades. To use a cliched metaphor, evolution, not intelligent design. There are many different ideas that made sense in various contexts, and they emerged as the regime that we currently have when the Financial Action Task Force put them all together in a mélange that then formed the basis for the 40 recommendations that we have until now. And that history has several important lessons for us. First, I think that it's fair to say that there are good intentions throughout, and that generally speaking, governments and parliaments have been thoughtful as they have been developing anti-money laundering regulation and later counter-terrorist financing rules. It's just that those rules never stemmed from a single source, and so they pursue different objectives at different points in time. And that leads to that second key lesson of the history of the regime, which is that our anti-money laundering regulation is not meant to pursue one thing alone, but it is an agglomeration, a hodgepodge of different ideas and objectives, and some of those are quite contradictory. And that leads me to the second key point that the book is making, which goes to that tension between exclusion and surveillance that Nora has already so eloquently identified in her opening remarks. And I was really struck by that point in one of the very first big financial crime conferences that I attended in around 2017, when a senior compliance expert in one of the big British banks said, well, actually, I don't mind criminals banking with me because then we can report about their activities. But that, of course, is a very different approach to what many other banks would say and how they would think about this issue. Because if criminals are banking with you, then you do bear higher costs of monitoring, and you might potentially even have to think about your own liability for money laundering if you don't get the balance exactly right. And so the twin ideas of excluding criminals from the legitimate economy on the one hand and surveilling their financial activities on the other hand can be contradictory. They're not perfectly compatible. And then there are further layers of complication in the way that the current financial crime regime operates, because this is not the only tension there is. There are other values and principles that we all hold dear that continue to inform the global anti-financial crime regime. One of those values is financial privacy. We could imagine a world where all financial information about our transactions is simply handed over to governments in bulk. And one might argue that certain countries in the world are closer to that than other countries. But this is not what the FATF recommendations require. This is not what countries like the UK, the US, Australia, or any of the European countries are doing, because there would be an immense trade-off in that, self-evidently. So the boundaries between financial surveillance of suspicious activities and financial privacy keep being renegotiated as we go along. And that becomes especially obvious when new technologies emerge. So 30 years ago, we basically settled, we as a global community, the debate on whether there should be anonymous bank accounts, the answer being no, no way. Now we're having very similar debates in the context of cryptocurrency. Can we have anonymous cryptocurrency transactions? Yes or no? A legitimate privacy tool or something that is only meant to cater to a criminal clientele? That is one example of those latent tensions between privacy and surveillance that sometimes manifest themselves. And then, of course, often there is this broader civic notion of the presumption of innocence. We shouldn't be treating people as presumptively criminal in their interactions with governments and banks. That also infuses our approaches to financial crime regulation. When is someone liable to be reported to the government? When is someone liable to be refused banking services on account of potential involvement in criminal activities? All those are high-level policy issues that the regime gives rise to. And that leads me to the third main point in the book. One of the striking features of the financial crime regime, and I would argue one of the reasons why we're so uncertain, to put it mildly, about the effectiveness of the regime, is that all those difficult policy questions, do report someone, do deny someone access to banking services, how do you approach customers from a high-risk jurisdiction, Iranian doctors who've done nothing wrong but happen to have a passport of a high-risk country. All of those profoundly important societal choices are outsourced to private sector institutions who are regulated under this regime. And that is a well-known feature of the framework. People have been writing for decades about the deputization of regulated businesses with essentially law enforcement functions. The argument that I'm making in the book is that the problem is not so much deputization. It is inevitable. There are good reasons why we ask banks and other regulated businesses to do all those things. The problem is the undirected nature of that deputization, the lack of incentives that would align private sector action with law enforcement and policy objectives. Very often governments do not provide clear parameters of how those policy dilemmas ought to be resolved. And it is even less often that they create any real incentives for banks and other regulated businesses to comply in a way that is purposeful and meaningful. One often hears references to tick box compliance, which simply refers to banks and others doing whatever is easiest and whatever is cheapest to do, which very often involves some form of blanket de-risking. And we might bemoan those approaches, but ultimately they're doing what is perfectly lawful and rational for them to do in the absence of other incentives. And so the last chapter, one of the last chapters in the book, deals with that question of how can one recalibrate incentives and what are the mechanisms that different countries are utilizing to better align private sector compliance practices with law enforcement objectives. And there are a number of those approaches. For example, public-private partnerships, targeted reporting regimes that go beyond suspicious activity reporting, and so on. But one of the key challenges in that area is scaling those mechanisms for alignment. It's very easy to call one bank and say, hey, can I talk to a compliance team? And we figure out the best approach to a particular situation. It is much more difficult to ensure that at scale, there are incentives in place to ensure that the regulated population as a whole make those difficult choices in a way that is best aligned with sound law enforcement objectives and public policy considerations. So this is a very brief overview of the key messages in the book. There are more things there on terrorist financing and sanctions in particular, but this, I hope, sets the stage for some of the discussion that will follow, and I very much look forward to the views from the discussants, who will no doubt have their own opinions. So I'll stop here. Thank you, Nora.
Thank you so much, Anton, for giving us such a rich overview and providing that context of the evolution of for the financial crime regulatory space. I see a lot of overlap here in terms of other areas of work where, as you put it, the private sector has been deputized or given this outsourced law enforcement role, and a lot of the dilemmas and conflicts that arise from that, not just from the effectiveness perspective, but also from a human rights, financial privacy, and civil liberties perspective as well. But again, so much to extrapolate from this. I'm going to resist from engaging any further because I know Valsimus will have some fantastic insights to also share with us. So Valsimus, whenever you're ready, thank you.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you very much. First of all, a big thank you to Nora and to the Institute for the invitation. And of course, a big thank you to Anton for producing this really fantastic book. You know, I recommend reading it. It is no surprise, you know, to read such a textured, sophisticated, rich, insightful analysis of this topic, which remains contested many years after its policy launch, you know, into the world. And Anton documents this very nicely in the book. So I think that I read, Anton, the book as also indicating a sense of frustration from your part in terms of the inconsistencies and inefficiencies of the current system. And so I think any FATF member or government expert would love to read this book and really to help you advise them. So, you know, well done on this. For the purpose of today's seminar, I'm going to share just a few reflections, which perhaps can be combined with questions, which are selective, but I think are representative of a range of issues that you wanted to address. And the first issue, I think, is that you talk about the key objectives being exclusion and surveillance, and their perhaps inconsistencies or contradictions between them. And it made me think of another perennial question, which is really, what is money laundering law for? So, you know, why do we need legislation on money laundering? And, you know, Peter has written extensively on this as well. And there are, I'm going to throw, for the purposes of the discussion, three of the justifications, and then perhaps for us to reflect about whether these justifications match actually the objectives that you focus on the book. So the first one, which you critique quite vigorously in the book, I think, is that we need AML in order to protect the integrity of the financial system. I think this is something that has been put forward by the FATF, but also by the European Union, partly to justify its competence in the field. And then we have security objectives, but we have two slightly different security objectives that perhaps we could discuss. The first one is to target really the predicate crime, and to have another means in the field of law enforcement and criminal justice, really to punish, if you like, the predicate. And we have moved on from this paradigm, but this is one way of looking at the system. And the other is to, for a broader, if you like, crime prevention or preemption perspective, if you like, to neutralize criminals, including organized crime, to prevent the commission of future crimes. So I think that perhaps I would welcome a comment on how do you see the various justifications for AML, if you like, related to the objectives that you have decided to focus on, which is exclusion and surveillance, because I think the objectives that you espouse may lead perhaps to a greater focus on one or another, to exclusion or surveillance, in a sense. What is the balance between the two? In a sense, I would be interested in your view on that. So that's the first point, I think, or reflection, if you like. The second thing that you made me again reflect upon is what is the relationship between criminal law and, if you like, regulation or regulatory law, or the so-called preventive AML duties. You start by looking at, rationales, if you like, related to criminal law. Then the book kind of abandons them. I think you focus quite a lot, and you mentioned in your introduction, on effectiveness in terms of the preventive AML regimes, quite a lot. So I think this is really, you criticize suspicious activity reports, and the way the private sector has responded really to the duties. So I would welcome perhaps a comment from you. How do you see the relationship between criminal law and preventive regulatory law? And just perhaps to put a provocation, do we really need criminal law on money laundering? Can we survive perhaps with only a preventive system? And I'm saying that because, you beautifully analyze defensive reporting, especially in the UK on AML, which is, an ongoing conversation in the United Kingdom. And there, I think you have an interesting reality, because the UK is one of the few states in Europe, at least, which have chosen to criminalize failure to report. So I think, in a very simplistic kind of thing, no wonder banks report everything. If the ultimate sanction for, failure to report is a criminal one, then you would report everything, in a sense. There's no escaping defensive reporting. The law commission tried, but, failed, I think, to put something more coherent. There are clear real life implications on that. Secondly, do we really need the money laundering offenses? What do they add, to the objectives on AML? Is criminal law being abused, really? Does it add any value? Do you measure AML effectiveness on the basis of prosecutions, for instance? I would be interested in your view on that. And do we need AML prosecutions to have an effective AML system? Just a thought. The third point goes back again to what we're saying about the private sector. And we all know that, and Nora mentioned that, AML were the first, in EU law at least, was the first major instance of co-opting the state co-option of the private sector. Since then, we have quite a lot of instances, including, of course, data retention, passenger surveillance, content moderation for counterterrorism purposes, the Digital Services Act, and so on and so forth. But AML was the first. And you are quite critical of the way in which this paradigm has evolved in practice. And one of the issues that you criticize is the fact that the law gives a lot of discretion to private actors. So although, they are subject to a series of duties, they still exercise quite a lot of discretion. And then you talk about a more directional, if you like, control. And I guess my question to that would be, and a more differentiated, if you like, preventive regime. And my question to you would be, would this be achieved through law? So is legislation the best way to achieve it? Or is there another way? Because my sense is that you can legislate all you want. I think it's really difficult sometimes to avoid discretion as to how the actors implement. And also, how can you differentiate in a law that should be equally applicable to everyone, in a sense? So, what is there a tension between differentiation and universally applicable law, if you like, in the preventive system? You know that probably we don't share exactly the same view in terms of the emphasis, the need to emphasize the impact on the affected individuals. You mentioned this, but I think in the book, the impact on all of this is, I see it as a bit, so I see the book as more focused on how we can have an effective system in terms of helping law enforcement rather than looking really at what the legislation does really on all of us, all of us who are affected by this. And I think what was not so much in the book, but perhaps it's the topic of your next book, is the role of financial intelligence and the financial intelligence units, if you like, as actors in terms of recalibrating the relationship between the state, banks, and the affected individuals. So, RFIUs, if you like, a factor of preserving civil liberties or of undermining them even further. In the EU, we have a lot of proposals now and the new legislation going towards maximal data exchange between FIUs, for example, and this is quite interesting to study. Finally, a point on technology. You mentioned technology in the context of cryptocurrency. What about AI? Does the use of AI, especially by banks, but also by FIUs, change really your calculation and your conclusions? These are all thoughts. I really, really enjoyed reading your book. I recommend it to anyone who is interested in the field, and I look forward to the other interventions and to your responses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valsimis. And yes, just as expected, some very rich insights and provocations there, Anton, in terms of the arguments that the book makes, in terms, I think in particular, the essence of criminal law and the role that criminal law is playing in this space. And again, back to that point of that very thorny challenge and issue of how we measure effectiveness. And Valsimis gave that metric of, well, is it rate of prosecutions? Is that how we assess effectiveness, or are there other measures? Are there other measures outside of the criminal justice sphere by which we measure that effectiveness? Anton, it give you complete discretion if you want to respond to anything specific now, or to wait until we've heard the contributions from Peter and Marine. So would you like to have any quick reply now, or would you like to wait?
Thanks, Nora. I think it might be better to wait, and then I might see if I can group some of those responses together.
Perfect. Thanks, Anton. Peter, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a really well-written book. It's engagingly written, and it's good to see the sort of use of tables and diagrams that you don't frequently get in academic writing. I'm going to say something that's critical because that's what Anton's invited me to do. But that doesn't mean I don't think it's a really good book. I do. I kind of gave up writing in this area 7 or 8 years ago because I just found myself repeating myself and kind of quit. It might even make me take up my pen again. I don't know. Anyway, let me choose 3 or 4 particular issues. First of all, the one that arises on page 1. And I was really surprised by this, that Anton is shocked that bad people do good paintings, and he doesn't want to have anything to do with paintings by bad people. And of course, that will rule out from his appreciation of the history of art people like Caravaggio, who was a murderer, Benvenuto Cellini, who also was a murderer. I mean, I like their violent scenes because we know that about them. And I think Orwell's essay, Benefit of Clergy, deals very well with good art by bad people. Do we care that Picasso was a total shit, and so on? More seriously, historiography. I'm currently writing about Donald Trump, and I've been thinking a lot about the way in which we write history and the relationship between individual agency and broader socioeconomic trends. Anton's account of the history seems to me to end up, and this is paragraph 2.5, I've been using the Kindle version, so I don't know the pages. It's, well, we were always going to end up here, and it's probably not such a bad thing that we have. What I want to suggest is that the history of laundering does contain pivotal moments, moments of choice, moments of potential change, and frequently we don't know enough. Anton says, well, you know, the people considered before legislating. Frequently they didn't, and we don't know enough about why various rules were put in place. Just to go through 6 very quickly. If Nixon had not declared the war on drugs in the late 60s, early 70s, the state would not have created the marketing drugs from which criminals benefited and would not have had to do anything about the profits that they made. Then you get the extension of laundering laws beyond drugs. And that decision was taken without waiting to see whether the regime was working in the case of drugs, and manifestly it wasn't. Then you get the move to charging money laundering separately and severing the link with the predicate offense. And again, that was something that it's actually very difficult to pin down in any given jurisdiction who took that decision. The extension of laundering laws beyond organized crime, the extension of laundering laws to govern the proceeds of tax evasion, which just kind of happened for some reason to do with FATF, but FATF is, or at least at that stage, it's less so now, but was a very difficult body to interrogate. Now, each of these changes were made by individual people. I would like to know who they were, why they did it, and how, if at all, they are held accountable. We generally don't know. As to the harms in laundering, first of all, can we hear no more about this security of financial institutions stuff and BCCI? BCCI did not go bust because it was laundering money. It went bust because the owners were stealing the depositors' money. Since the dawn of time, no major financial institution has ever perished because it was laundering money. If it really does provide a danger to the solvency of the institution, then you would expect the shareholders to deal with it, but they haven't. Now, so one potential harm is the complicity in the predicate. Another one you don't really explore, and I think it's important in the empty pizzeria cases, is money laundering as anti-competitive behavior. You know, I operate a coffee shop into which I launder the money that I make selling drugs, as a consequence of which I put your coffee shop out of business. I do think that's a serious problem, and it needs to be dealt with. Let me tell you quickly an anecdote about the PEP rules. Anton refers to the moans of Lord Vasey and Lord Clement Jones about the effect of the more or less scattergun effect of the rules upon them, you don't have to look to the House of Lords to find people who are disgruntled. Consider this. I am a Brummie. I'm from Birmingham, and I have a sentimental attachment to my hometown. And the way I maintain that is by supporting Aston Villa at football and Warwickshire at cricket, and rather more unusually to Lloyds Bank, which was originally a Brummagem bank. It's a hopeless bank, but there we are. My partner is a woman called Ann Mumford, who is a US citizen from Rhode Island. Around 2018 or 2019, we needed a US dollars bank account registered to our UK address, and it couldn't be in Anne's name for some reason I can't remember. UK financial institutions have problems giving accounts to US citizens, probably because of FATCA, and it might have been that. Anyway, Anne's mother went into politics when she retired from being a high school English teacher. All politics is local, and Carol Mumford was a Republican. She died in 2014. She had been a member of the Rhode Island House of Representatives, equivalent to, say, to being on a London Borough Council, I suppose, and she had been the National Committee woman for Rhode Island. You've probably heard of the Republican National Committee. It's a committee of 100 people, one man, one woman from each state. There are not many Republican women in Rhode Island, so I don't suppose it was a particularly hotly contested post. Now, I know there are banks that offer accounts in more than one currencies, but the ridiculous loyalty I hold to Lloyd's kicked in. I called them up and said, could you do me this account denominated in US dollars? And they said, no, but we can arrange for Lloyd's on the Isle of Man to do it. Fine, I said. As the application was going through, I got a phone call from the Isle of Man. They're very polite. They have Liverpudlian accents. Balsamis would be at home with them. And they told me that they were obliged to regard me as a politically exposed person because of my links to Carol, who had then been dead for 4 or 5 years. When I checked the relevant rules, I found that under the UK money laundering regs, you are a PEP if you are entrusted with prominent public functions, other than as a middle ranking or more junior official, and you stop being a PEP if you are no longer so entrusted, or by implication, if you die. So there were 2 issues. First of all, was Carol ever a PEP? Probably not. You just don't know with overseas political parties how, where the room where it happens is, where the decisions are made. And so I expect they assume that the Republican National Committee is a place where decisions are made. It's not. It's actually a fundraising organization, and the policy decisions are made elsewhere. But at least you've heard of them. I don't know, for example, what the policy-making mechanisms are within Macron's La République En Marche or Merz's Christian Democrats. And I don't even know the names of the governing parties in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. So, well, as I say, under the UK rules, once you're dead, you're dead. Rather to my surprise, however, the rules in the Isle of Man spread the net more widely. And the mere fact that your relative is dead doesn't stop you from being subject to all these rules, which, my point, and I got to it, are a ridiculous and burdensome scattergun. As to the conclusion, Anton wants to exclude proceeds from the legitimate economy. I don't think I do. And I don't think you could, even if you wanted to. we're getting a new carpet installed in a couple of weeks' time. The estimate which we agreed included a sum to be paid in advance to the company providing the carpet, and that the fitter should be paid separately in cash. That is to say, the fitter is probably evading tax on his income. I couldn't care less. Fine. And if you really want to say that the money we pay him becomes proceeds of crime, well, you know, this is getting silly, isn't it? At the latest, from a time around 2000, supposed proceeds of tax evasion began to be treated as proceeds of crime for the purpose of all these regimes. It's just not practicable to identify any particular account or any particular pile of notes and coins as being either the proceeds or not the proceeds of crime. If we are to evaluate the effectiveness of the regime, the place I would start is to find out what it costs, and I would add together all the salaries of all the people in compliance. But we're still left with the issue which is seldom addressed. What if, you know, we add to the regime and we add to the regime and we add to the regime and we say, if only this, then it would be better, and if only this, then... What if it just can't ever really work? Are we going to go back to a golden age of you know, unregulated drugs? How would we deal with the thing that beats whatever system you put in place? So those are my rather grumpy observations.
Thanks so much, Peter. That was very rich and very, very diverse. I must admit, references to Caravaggio and critiques of Picasso were not what I was quite expecting from interventions this evening, but they fit very perfectly. Maureen, the floor is yours. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nora. And Anton and me join my colleague in congratulating you for publishing your book, which I find really engaging, as Peter said. And I really appreciate that following the very rich and nuanced analysis, you take the reader to examples of new guiding principles for the AML framework. And I think it really helped me visualize what recalibration would actually look like in practice. Also, your book is a good tiny reminder that when objectives are defined too broadly and precisely, for instance, the integrity of the financial market, the result can be unintended and sometimes even undesirable consequences. But on the other hand, when we define clear objectives, we don't have to have objectives that exclude each other. So I'm gonna have some quick reflection and questions on the role of private actors, who, as you wrote, are deputized within the AML framework. It was really, as Vaslamis already said, it was the first co-opting that took place. Now it's in many, many fields. You described the uncertainty that they face. We also read about it in the chat with the question we have, that when it's undirected, it comes with issues and unintended consequences. That governments, when they're reluctant to make difficult policy choices, the burden falls on businesses to implement rules. And so, as you rightfully note, the choice made by financial institutions, they have direct effects on individuals' privacy, financial privacy, on the presumption of innocence, and even on having access to a bank account, which today it should be universal service or rather right. And in your conclusion, you capture one of the dilemma, which is the logic of financial crime prevention might point toward large-scale de-risking, while the imperative of financial inclusion pushes the other way. So there is always this tension between also the interest and the objective for the financial sector. And you know that, as many do in other fields, that such balancing exercises should not be left in the hands of private actors. Instead, clear, coherent, and inconsistent governmental regulation needs to be issued. And you also rightly point out that private actors, of course, they have their own interest, and they may have different ones depending on which actor we are talking about. And it may or may not align with law enforcement, depending on the circumstances. And as I said, several fields are having the similar issues. More recently, we have the Digital Services Act at the EU level, where now private actors are being co-opted to moderate content, but also to fight against illegal content. And so they have different, they're pushed also in different directions, and they may have to balance rights as well between maybe be sanctioned under the GSA and then thinking about freedom of expression. The question also came up in the field of airborne communication, even though it's a bit more straightforward because we are simply expecting in the EU with the new regulation to have service provider comply with requests for data orders. So what it comes up to is that there is no escaping the involvement of private actors. And I share your opinion that it's really much about how we direct the sector and how we have safeguards as well. So this leads to my first question, even though I don't think a single answer can be given. I would really appreciate to have your thoughts on this. How do we think about deputization in the sense that what would be a more coherent way of approaching the role of the private sector if you consider the policy objectives? And in a way, you already answered that in the book, but I just want to put this for the audience as well. And also the rights that need safeguarding. And this lead me to another question, thoughts that I had, which is, if you think about it, if we provide clearer, more functional guidance, would this not only align the private sector action more closely with public authorities' priorities, as you suggest in your book, but it could also provide these actors with a degree of protection, a clearer sense of responsibility, and a safer space in which they can operate. But also this could help protect rights better. Because if you stop an account from being closed, or if you guarantee financial privacy because you have better rules, then everyone benefits from the system, so to say. And as it's mentioned, rightfully mentioned also in the chat, it's avoiding over-enforcing. And so by doing that, you, in a way, protect the rights at stake. So yeah, I would be curious to, even though we don't have much time left, to hear your reflection on what recalibration of the framework would mean for private actors, and if you also agree, what would be the benefits or the trade-off you see emerging from a recalibration?
Thanks so much, Maureen. And I think some really important points there, especially on the mainstreaming of human rights and the recalibration of these rules. So, Anton, the clock is ticking. You have a really fantastic, rich set of provocations and insights and critiques from our three really excellent discussants. So I will give the floor to you in terms of reflecting on all of these comments and questions. Anton.
Thank you, Nora, and thanks so much to all three of the discussants for the range of excellent comments and questions. I'll try to group them into three rubrics so I can address as many as I can. Inevitably, won't be able to do justice to all of the excellent points that have been made, but I'll start with history and objectives. And actually, Peter's introduction, the sort of foray into art history and the question of good art by bad people is quite relevant to this, because I think that a lot of the developments that we have seen over the past decades, really since the 1950s, but accelerating since the 1980s, were dictated by a sense of outrage when major financial institutions were found to have been facilitating the investment or use of proceeds of crime. And so one of the gripes that I have with the Financial Action Task Force's notion of financial integrity, and I share Peter's skepticism about that notion, is that it doesn't really drill down to what I think is the animating impetus behind much of this regulation. And it's simply preventing complicity by major businesses in money laundering. It's ensuring that the likes of HSBC, other banks, no longer launder money for drug cartels, or if they do, there is a mechanism to address that. And I agree entirely that we can never achieve complete exclusion of criminal proceeds from the legitimate economy. And for the reasons that the book outlines, all those other values and principles, we shouldn't be pursuing a truly zero tolerance approach to proceeds of crime in the legitimate economy. But I think it's, to my estimation, beyond doubt that over the past decades, public mores have shifted and we become increasingly intolerant towards the complicity of major businesses in someone's use of proceeds of crime. Anti-money laundering regulation is, as it were, the most formal expression of that sentiment. We also see others, when Deutsche Bank and others end up on the front pages of newspapers because they were doing business with Jeffrey Epstein. The point there is not so much a legal point about whether or not they complied with their obligations, but it's this general sense of, well, we don't want our major businesses to be profiting from that sort of behavior or those sorts of individuals. And so I think that a lot in our attitudes towards money laundering and our instincts actually comes down to the way that we as individuals feel about that motivation. What do we think about this objective of minimizing the complicity of the regulated financial sector and other businesses in crime? Because if one thinks that this is worthwhile, then that is a powerful reason to be in favor of some form of anti-money laundering regulation. And so the historiographical point that I'm making is not so much that one cannot imagine an alternative universe with those pivotal developments played out in a different way. I think there is an alternative universe out there where there are no anti-money laundering rules and we're still in a world of circa 1980s. The point that I'm making is that if we trace the public and policy-making responses to major scandals involving the financial sector, over time we see this ever greater sense of, no, this can't stand. We're not happy with US banks doing business with Mexican drug cartels, Swiss banks facilitating tax evasion, etc., etc., etc. And I think that that general sentiment is an important explanatory factor in when we have anti-money laundering regulation. And then, of course, it does make it very difficult to ascertain effectiveness, because if the objective is to prevent complicity by the regulated sector, then money laundering might still be happening outside that regulated sector, and criminals might not be making less money at all. But there is this moral, almost one might say puritanical, if one is critical, pursuit of minimizing that complicity. And I think, so my best understanding of what the FATF must mean by financial integrity is they probably mean something along those lines. Now, it is frustrating that they never articulate what financial integrity actually entails. I suspect that that logic of preventing complicity is at least an important part. And so going back to the point that Phil Simons made at the start about the objectives and whether, for example, we should prioritize targeting criminal activities or preventing them, I think that both are important, but ultimately there is this other element to the AML-CTF regime, which is not in a sense instrumental. It's not defined by relevance to any particular end state. We just don't want, we don't want regulated businesses to be facilitating money laundering. And then whether or not that results in crime disruption, crime prevention, is a separate consideration. It is an important consideration, but there is also this other undercurrent that actually has pretty little to do with any particularly well-defined or concrete objectives. But it still, I think, is valuable to some extent, because we saw what the world looked like before anti-money laundering regulation. Now, the role of the private sector, Maureen mentioned that there's probably no escape here. I agree with that, because ultimately, it is difficult to imagine a world where some form of customer due diligence does not exist. There are genuine law enforcement benefits in banks knowing whom they're dealing with and being able to provide that information to governments. So again, I think it's one of those elements of the regime where you might say it is inevitable in a certain sense that would develop. Other elements of the regime, other elements of the role of the private sector, like suspicious activity reporting, is perhaps somewhat more not tangential, but something more contingent. It could have been adopted. We could imagine an anti-money laundering regime without suspicious activity reporting, and the role of the private sector would have been somewhat different. The question that Balsamis asked there is whether the answer to the vast discretion on the part of the private sector is to minimize and box it in through more regulation. And I don't think that that's the answer, at least that's not the entire answer, because the real challenge that we're seeing here is incentives. It's the financial incentives that businesses are under. And one example that really is quite striking is simplified due diligence. When it became clear that unbanked people in some countries could not access banking services because they didn't have the right documents, you don't have your ID, your passport, etc., the FATF said, okay, in appropriate circumstances, banks should be allowed to adopt simplified due diligence measures, so they don't get all that information, and therefore that will in part solve the problem of financial exclusion. The challenge there is that if you are a bank and you engage in simplified due diligence, you still need to document why you think that simplified due diligence is appropriate in a particular case. So you still spend money on that, and your fundamental calculation does not change. You look at your previously unbanked customer, and you say, they're not worth the candle. They're not worth the effort of going through with the application of simplified due diligence. So a perfect example here of a regulatory response that crashes against the rocks of financial incentives that institutions have. And so one of the questions is, how does one recalibrate those incentives? I was struck that in 1984, one of the presidential commissions that looked at organized crime in the US said, well, maybe we should reward banks for good quality intelligence. I think that proposal has sort of been discarded and never seriously addressed. Every once in a while, you see versions of that, which are as simple as, well, why don't regulators praise banks more? So when they disrupt criminal activities with the facilitation of cooperation from a particular regulated business, let's make a bit more of a big deal about it so that people involved have some more tangible benefits for their careers and at least feel some warmth and love from the regulator and the community at large. But I think it's that incentives point that is really, really difficult. And the impact on individuals, that's to say the problem of de-risking, is really where it is particularly intractable. I really appreciated Peter's anecdote about the broad net that PEP controls are casting. And I did mention those examples of people in the House of Lords moaning about how they had to provide more documents to their banks. I have very little sympathy with them, because by that time, there'd been all those unbanked people and immigrants who had real problems with de-risking in financial services. Now, suddenly, when members of the House of Lords realize that they're PEPs and they need to provide some additional documents, they get all stroppy about the fact that banks are overreaching. But the point is that those are such difficult problems to solve. And so simplified due diligence is not working for the unbanked. What would work? One of the solutions that has been put out there and that I tentatively endorse in the book, I think would be a good idea to explore, is the right to basic bank accounts for everyone, a sort of differentiated tiered system of regulated services where some basic banking facilities should not be denied to anyone. And yes, monitoring and reporting should be in place, but you shouldn't just be denied access to a basic bank account, even if you are a higher risk customer and you do come from a jurisdiction that is a higher risk jurisdiction. And that, I think, goes to one of the questions that was asked in the chat as well, around that balance between financial surveillance and individual rights. I think that part of the answer is stratification of regulated services, so that some basic regulated services are available to everyone, and then surveillance and reporting kicks in. For other regulated services, maybe a different threshold is appropriate. If top-flight investment banking facilities are denied to someone because there's a mere suspicion of involvement in criminality, I don't think that that raises the same human rights challenges or human flourishing ramifications as, for example, denying someone access to a basic bank account. But there are other mechanisms as well. So various countries are experimenting with public-private partnerships. The challenge there is, how do you scale them? That is a real difficulty there. So I think in the interests of time, I will stop there. I realize there are more questions from the discussants. There's also a question from Rune in the chat that I will read properly and digest afterwards, if I may, but I suspect we might be running out of time, so I'll hand over to Nora at this stage.
Thank you so much, Anton. This is a very unenviable task that one has as a chair, to bring to everybody's attention the fact that we have in fact gone over time, but in the best possible way. This has been such a wonderfully rich and diverse conversation that we've had, and I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank our discussants, Marine, Peter, and Valsemis, for sharing their time and expertise. There's so much more that can be said about the arguments raised in the book and the dilemmas and the trade-offs that have been mentioned. And again, how your work engages with and builds on previous work by Valsemis and also Peter. I think the ambiguity underpinning the role of regulators really is so key to a lot of the arguments that you've been making in terms of financial integrity, and then how on earth you possibly then can make any affordances for mainstreaming human rights and civil liberties. And when I think one of the most significant points that you just made, Anton, was the just in access to all kinds of other human rights and freedoms in society that someone will be denied if they can't access a bank account or can't register to have a bank account, to have that stymied. I mean, it plays such a huge role. So those questions of overreach and how you ensure effectiveness of regulation and all these different competing objectives, how does one even start to make those assessments and gather those metrics, as Peter highlighted earlier on, especially when one doesn't even know the functions or even the organizations that are responsible for those roles. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thank really the man of the moment now. Anton, congratulations on a really excellent, thought-provoking and provocative book. I think I speak for all of us when we say we look forward to the second edition. There's so much material, I think, that we've just discussed in this one event. So congratulations again. My thanks to everybody who attended for all the comments and questions. And I'm going to take the opportunity now to wish everybody a good evening and hope to see you all again at some point soon. Thank you.